morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time of day you're deciding to watch this video. So I wanted to create a new video this semester if you're watching this in the spring of 2025, um, just to go over a very brief history of um, environmental policy and kind of like how did we get to where we are. Um, Initially, these were just kind of slides that I had you kind of go through, but I feel like it's always good to get a little bit of a verbal explanation as well. And we'll also be able to get you to kind of interact with the material a little bit better rather than just like scrolling through some slides. So, without any further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So what I wanted to do here is to give us a little brief introduction of environmental history. And it's not meant to be all inclusive by any stretch of the imagination. So I'm going to like just real kind of quick fire go through some of our little time periods here. And you may actually recognize some of the folks that I highlight. And I want you to think about these things with how things are currently going with the environment and with policies that are starting to go into place or ideas that are being floated by our current administration. So I've divided history into kind of 8 major time periods, and we'll see how things have kind of spanned out from there. So starting with our pre-European contact, so pre-1600s. So we had many diverse Native American cultures were on this land, many of whom were living quite sustainably. They had a relationship with the land. They knew that if they respected the land and gave to the land, then the land would give back to them. We have and continue to draw from these cultures to develop sustainable management practices. If you've looked into anything like sea otter restoration, or if you've heard about it, we are often, or folks along the coast are asking Native peoples, like, how did you live sustainably with these creatures so that we can practice those similar ideas? So I very much encourage you to do some more research on this area. And just doing a more thorough conversation about that kind of goes beyond the scope of this class a little bit, but I do encourage you to think about it. Then through the 1600s, the mid to late 1800s, I know there's a lot that happens between, that's a really long time period, right? So that was really dominated by this attitude of we must cover the frontier, right? Be the first in the area, kind of almost Lewis and Clark sort of idea. I want you to think about what this means to you, what you could potentially, what ideas stem from this when you hear those words and when you think about this time period. This picture I think is very telling. So we thought that there were these inexhaustible resources. We thought that we could just, our meaning or our purpose here is to dominate nature. We had this huge desire to conquer and exploit nature as quickly as possible. Rights of individuals to accumulate wealth was triumph. That kind of sounds really familiar. Maybe that's just like a human nature thing, apparently. But yeah, so the desire is to just like get through it and use these resources because we think that they won't go away. But in 40 years' time, an area the size of Europe was deforested in the Midwest, meaning Minnesota, Michigan, and Wisconsin. By 1897, Michigan sawmills had processed 160 billion board feet of lumber, which is less than 6 billion were left standing in the entire state. So that's just an enormous loss to forests. And now we understand like how important forests are. But again, tying back to our current presidential administration, there was just an idea floated to relinquish our dependency on importing lumber and gave the go-ahead to cut down an enormous amount of forests in America. So there's that. And then again, through these times, thankfully, in the 19th century, naturalists started to voice concern here. Thankfully, not everyone had this drill baby drill or cut baby cut attitude. Maybe you've heard of these names before: John James Audubon, Henry David Thoreau, George Perkins Marsh. I encourage you to learn more about them if you haven't heard of them before. But Marsh's writing had a profound influence on President Theodore Roosevelt. And maybe that guy sounds familiar. Because then, going forward into the late 1800s, early 1900s, an awakening in response to the previous period. So kind of starting to be like, oh, wait, hang, hold up. Can we pause a little bit, please, on what we're doing and look a little bit closer at what's going on. So these two men here symbolize two different movements of this area. Do you know who they are? Do they look familiar? And where they are? Does the place look familiar? Hint, hint, it's in California. And pretty important guy. I just kind of mentioned him in the previous slide. And this guy has a whole forest named after him in the Bay Area. Spoiler alert, it's Theodore Roosevelt on the left. So he was a utilitarian conservationist. So what does that mean? What did he believe? What specifically did he do? He was our 26th president from 1901 to 1909. So he did a lot of really amazing things. He believed that we should protect forests and resources because they are very useful to humans, and thus we needed to be conserved for future use. And this word conservation was meaning to have a careful management and use of resources, or a sustainable use. Remember, in our first couple weeks of this course, we defined that word sustainability. So, referring back to that, what does that mean? What did that mean then, and what does it mean now? And this sort of freshened idea of what we got. So he used the General Revision Act of 1891, where Roosevelt set aside more than 170 million acres of forest land, prompting industry to fight to repeal portions of the act in 1907. But then he established the U.S. Forest Service based on conservation ideals. There's some more info on that here. And then we had the General Revision Act, and the National Forest Service was brought forth in 1905. Then this guy on the right, John Muir, he is a biocentric preservationist. So what were the things that he believed? What specifically did he do? Well, he believed that nature had the right to exist for its own sake, regardless of its usefulness to humans. So Teddy was like, yo, nature is here for us to use, for our purpose, for our usefulness. John Muir was like, no, it's just here to be here. It doesn't need to be useful to humans. So he also recognized the aesthetic and spiritual value of nature, which is huge. If you've ever been out to nature, it's in like even just going on a hike or like on a walk through your neighborhood, you can like, I feel like you can, it really helps in your mental health, or even just going like to the beach or something, or what are people saying? They did, go touch grass. Well, there is some sort of truth to that, right? We come from nature, so it makes sense to want to be in nature. So this term preservation means the setting aside of undisturbed areas and maintaining them in a pristine state. So there's conservation, there's preservation. Conservation is kind of like bringing things back from a harmed state. Preservation is, hey, let's just block this stuff off now so that we don't have to go through this part of having to conserve it. It's already preserved. He was also super instrumental in the establishment of, Yosemite National Park, which is what is in the picture behind here. He also founded the Sierra Club. So he's done a lot for California specifically, which is fantastic. You love to see it. First national park was Yellowstone in 1872. Yellowstone is the one that's up in Wyoming and Montana, Idaho. I've never been there personally, but I've heard it's absolutely beautiful. I've seen pictures and stuff. I've driven south of it, just have not had the opportunity to go to it. If you have, that's amazing. And then Yosemite and Sequoia National Parks in 1890. And then National Park Service was founded in 1916. So they were established under this notion of preservation, and consider what is and what is not permitted in national parks currently. And I also, again, if you're watching this in the spring of 2025, consider the current attacks on federal agencies and what issues that will have to various national parks, not just ones that are close to home, but around the country. So a National Park Service that's been here for over 100 plus years, and folks are being let go for frivolous reasons. Moving forward a little bit, we got Franklin Roosevelt. He establishes CCC and SCS. So what in tarnation are those programs and how did they influence public opinion? And then we also have the Sand County Almanac from Aldo Leopold. So after World War II, we are now in a huge technological boom, kind of moving forward in time now. So compared to our allies, we suffered little to no damage to our home soil. Of course, not with discounting what happened in Hawaii, but like in the United States as a whole, the contiguous United States, I guess I should say, no rebuilding was really necessary here. So we had a massive workforce, new technologies, no competition. Japan and Europe were still rebuilding. There was a lot of on home soil damage to those locations. So we were able to focus on other things. And so this led to profits and high standards of living and all that kind of stuff. So it was a huge tech boom. And then military technologies, were refabricated for peaceful domestic use, chemical pesticides, fertilizers, nuclear power, satellites, sonar, all these different things. Actually, as much as I don't necessarily enjoy the military, the technologies that come out of the military have been useful for normal citizens like you and me. Within that, our ingenuity will seemingly solve all of our problems. So again, some examples here: fertilizers and pesticides dramatically increase yields, right? Because you're allowing crops to grow for longer or not get eaten by pests, things like that, grow bigger, grow more flush, things like that. Then nuclear power is promoted as too cheap to meter. You'll never pay for electricity or water again. We kind of know what happened there. Unfortunately, nuclear has a very bad rap, sadly. From here, continuing on, we have this consciousness rising in the 1960s. That's when the hippies came about. Maybe your parents, certainly my parents, or at least my mom, hippie movement. And then the 1970s, the decade of the environment. Let's go. This is when a ton of environmental policies and acts came into play. I encourage you to look at all of the different environmental policies, some of which are under attack today, which is unfortunate. I like clean drinking water. I don't know about you all, but I certainly do. So in this eye-opening situation, there were several groundbreaking books and articles published in scientific and popular literature. And then we start to see these consequences of new technologies from the 40s and 50s. This lovely gal here is Rachel Carlson. She published The Silent Spring in 1962. Paul Ehrlich published The Population Bomb in 1968 and Tragedy of the Commons, which, hey, we have learned about in 1969. And then, other things started to happen. This oil spill off on the Santa Barbara coast, a river in Ohio, I'm not gonna be able to say that, catches fire and burns for 8 days, oozes rather than flows, to which a person does not drown but decays. Just lots of bad things here. And then in response to the 1960s consciousness rising, citizens started to demand more regulation. Many of our most important environmental laws were passed with often no opposition. And our first Earth Day, was April 22nd in 1970. And we are coming up on that anniversary. So real quick here, we had just a few of the laws in the 1970s that we're going to address later. You're going to learn about NEPA actually in the next lecture, but things like, again, the Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, Endangered Species Act, all of which we're going to cover in a little while. Some of us think that NEPA is one of our most important environmental laws. So again, your next lecture video, if you are taking environmental science, will cover NEPA a little bit further. But of course, then there's backlash in the 1980s. So after a decade of strong legislation, corporations resist and try to weaken and or repeal laws and rules. Again, exactly what we are going through now, and it's really disheartening. So President Reagan appoints pro-business environmental legislators or regulators, leaves top environmental positions unfilled, and adopts small government mantra, less funding for research, regulation, and enforcement. Thus, corporate power prevails, and this environmental regulations are bad for business becomes paramount. Again, this is a big thought with what is happening now. This is like a consciousness of our current higher ups is drill, baby, drill, F the environment, all for profit, not for planet. So a few things here in the 1990s, we had rapid globalization of industry and communications. The global South gains more of a voice finally. So South America, Africa, or a good majority of Africa, Australia. So environmental justice. The movement starts to broaden and builds as connections are made between environmental issues and poverty, classism, racism, social justice in general. We talked about environmental racism in a few weeks ago. And then, of course, inclusiveness and diversity. Better be careful saying those words, my goodness. Where the environmental movement really begins to better reflect a larger society. So I want you to think here, how do you summarize the state of the environmental movement today? You can already kind of see and hear my opinion on how things are going. I think that there is a great rise in younger generations understanding that climate change is an issue. Environmental problems, are still happening. If we weaken these environmental laws, that's not going to be good for anybody. Again, I love me some good drinking water. I love clean air, cleanish air, things like that. And so I think that there's like a dichotomy or a separation between business people and wanting to just make money, again, profit over planet, versus a more starting to be more vocal, I hope, generation of people trying to fight for the environment. And when they recognize how important the environment is, when it is very important, right? If you want to leave a home that's pristine and nice for children, if you choose to have them, then you have to fight for the environment, in my opinion. We all know I'm not having kids, but if I feel for your kids, if you choose to have them, or my nieces and nephews, best friends' kids, etc. So be sure to review all that information. We'll dive further into other policies and things like that moving forward. But I hope that this was helpful in getting a nice, quick, brief review of environmental history. Thank you.